The ancient Taoist text Zhuangzi describes Liezi as the sage who rode the wind, with an admirable indifference to external things. And thus, in his lightness, he was free from all desires to pursue the things that supposedly make us happy. Lie Yoku, also known as Liezi or Master Li, is attributed as the author of the eponymous ancient Taoist text. Even though there is a debate among scholars whether or not Liezi truly existed as a person, the text is considered the third most important scripture in Taoism after the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. The Liezi contains many stories with philosophical themes like the nature of reality, the purpose of life, and the workings of the mind. One theme that runs like a thread through this ancient scripture is the tendency of human beings to stand in their own way, and thereby sabotaging a spontaneous, effortless mode of living. Dominated by a mind burning with desire, anxiously trying to control the uncontrollable, we've become unwilling and unable to let the universe run its natural course, as we have exchanged spontaneity for fear. And the more we fight the universe, the more painful our lives become, as things inevitably change in directions we don't like. But how can we re-embark the natural flow of life? What if we dare to let go of our attachments and desires, our fears and inhibitions, and become as light as a feather like Liezi? This video explores the Taoist philosophy of Liezi on how to let go and ride the wind. The second book of the Liezi tells how this Taoist sage let go of the weight of the world and became so light that he was able to ride the wind and float with the clouds. This happened after a period of disciplining his body and mind, during which he let go of conceptions of right and wrong. After years of practice, Liezi experienced that the barrier between himself and the outside world had disappeared, as well as the heaviness of his bones and flesh. Without knowing it, I was being carried by the wind, he stated, drifting here and there. I did not know whether I rode on the wind or the wind rode on me. End quote. Now, riding the wind isn't to be taken literally. It's a metaphor for a mental state that we could experience according to the Taoist sages, in which we move lightly through life, as if we're floating. We ride the wind when external circumstances don't weigh us down, because we don't resist them, but live in harmony with them. Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi also pointed to this state in their unique ways. Zhuangzi tells us to let our minds wander in the pure and simple, to be one with the infinite, and to let all things take their course. Lao Tzu describes it as becoming one with the dust, and that those who do cannot be benefited nor harmed, approached nor alienated, made noble nor suffer disgrace. Imagine how light life would be if nothing in the universe could harm us. We can find a beautiful description of this state of riding the wind in the second book of the Liezi, which tells us about a legendary Yellow Emperor who suffered ill health and restlessness after ruling the country for many years. 4 years he had pushed himself anxiously, governing the country to the greatest detail. But when he decided to take a break and retired from his duties, he indulged in the greatest pleasures to satisfy the senses. But these modes of life left him exhausted and jaded. The Yellow Emperor stated, "I pampered myself too much and then pushed myself too hard. No wonder I lost my health and my inner peace." End quote. So he decided to distance himself from his imperial duties and stay away from sensual pleasures that he had previously indulged in. He retreated to his private quarters to engage in what the Taoists call the fasting of the heart. This refers to the art of freeing oneself from earthly desires, so the body synchronizes with the natural course of things. And thus, for 3 months, the Yellow Emperor abstained from intervention in government and subdued the senses. But it seems that he wanted results too quickly. Mind you, that it took Liezi many years before he was able to ride the wind. So was it realistic to expect results so fast? the Yellow Emperor had worn himself out after a relatively short time of isolation. Exhausted, he fell asleep during the day and dreamed about a journey to a faraway kingdom. This kingdom had no ruler, it simply went on by itself. Its people didn't have cravings and desires outside of their instincts and weren't attached to life nor averse to death. They were without preference and prejudice, hence love and hate didn't occur, and things like attraction, repulsion, wanting, disliking, gain and loss were all alien to these people, who seemed to be consistently unaffected by external circumstances, and it was as if they moved about like gods. I quote, "Water had no power to drown them, nor fire to burn. Cuts and blows caused them neither injury nor pain. Scratching or tickling could not make them itch. They bestrode the air as though treading on solid earth. They were cradled in space as though resting in a bed." End quote. After his dream, the Yellow Emperor felt enlightened. He told his ministers that he now comprehended the way, but also understood that the way cannot be perceived by the senses nor explained by words. He realized that one cannot become enlightened by conscious thinking and effort, but that it's something that happens spontaneously, in his case, in a dream, which occurred after he stopped trying. Great orderliness followed in the empire, and when the Yellow Emperor passed away, the people mourned his death for 200 years. The question is, of course, how can one become as light as a Taoist sage and ride the wind? The second book of Liu Tzu gives us several hints on how to pull this off. However, there's a paradoxical nature to it. On one end, there's a certain practice involved to let go of earthly desires, as well as the numerous categories and ideas created by the mind. On the other end, enlightenment seems to happen suddenly. In the case of Liu Tzu, it took years. But the Yellow Emperor was enlightened after just a couple of months. In both cases, the change occurred when, during their practice, they reached a state of non-practice. So this sudden, spontaneous moment when one's body ceases to be heavy and one begins to float along with the wind like the seeds of a dandelion is aligned with the Taoist idea of doing without doing, or non-action. It's only when we stop striving, stop making effort, quit going somewhere, stop fighting against what is, that we get where we want to be, in the flow state, in which we float along with nature's current entirely, instead of resisting it. This, according to Lao Tzu, is how one achieves mastery of the world. I quote, "One who seeks knowledge learns something new every day. One who seeks the Tao unlearns something new every day. Less and less remains until you arrive at non-action. When you arrive at non-action, nothing will be left undone. Mastery of the world is achieved by letting things take their natural course. You cannot master the world by changing the natural way." End quote. Liu Tzu explained to his disciple, a man named Yin Sheng, what he went through before he became as light as a feather. He mentioned that after he let go of the notions of right and wrong, there was no barrier between himself and the outside world. So it seems that he stopped experiencing the separateness that was previously created by the mind, and that it's a sense of separateness that causes us to feel heavy and suffer. One day, Liu Tzu asked the Taoist sage Wen Tzu why an enlightened person cannot be drowned by water nor burned by fire. Wen Tzu explained that even though we separate things based on their external features, everything is fundamentally the same, as everything comes from the same origin. So when we cease to see ourselves separated from water, it won't drown us. And when we cease to see ourselves separated from fire, it won't burn us. Hence, the man who danced in the fire said, "What are rocks? What are flames? I don't know what you're talking about." Like the story about riding the wind, these examples can be used as metaphors for how we can free ourselves from being affected by the world around us. Again, these shouldn't be taken too literally, and deeper meaning can be found if we read the whole second book, which tells us about the many miracles that people are capable of when they are in the flow state. And also, which is perhaps even more important, how people tend to lose these abilities. A farmer named Shang jumped from the highest cliffs without breaking a bone, obtained jewels from the deepest rivers, and rescued bundles of silk out of a burning building. He did all of this in pure spontaneity, without hesitation or fear and desire for profit or a good reputation among his kinsmen. Only when he started thinking about the risks, he discovered what it's like to be afraid and began to doubt his capabilities. Hence, he decided to never do these things again. So when farmer Sheng jumped into the arena of life without reluctance, he wasn't held back by doubt because he had nothing to gain or lose. He embarked on a natural flow of life and just did what he did. But from the very moment that his mind took over, he was standing in his own way. Anxious about the terrible fate he could meet at the end of the river stream, he started holding onto rocks and branches. And thus, his body became a heavy burden, as opposed to the weightlessness he experienced when he still flowed along with the stream. Or, as philosopher Alan Watts stated when reflecting on Liezi, what is this then? Weightlessness. It means, partly, that you're not moving around in constant opposition to yourself. Most people move in constant opposition to themselves because they are afraid that if they don't oppose themselves all the time, something awful will happen. End quote. Liezi shows us that only when we transcend the duality of life, things like gain and loss, attraction and repulsion, wonderful and awful, we can become truly indifferent and start acting for no other reason than the action itself. Because what's to fear when the outcome is irrelevant? When we achieve this state, we don't swim in the water, but the water swims us. And we aren't burned by fire, but we become the burning itself. And before we know it, on a stormy day, we may suddenly start riding the wind. Thank you for watching.
The Liezi is often considered to be the third greatest text of Taoist thought, behind the Tao Te Ching or Lao Tzu and the Zhuangzi. The Liezi can be a great introductory text to an often misunderstood philosophy of life. Taoism can often seem irrational and contradictory, but the wisdom of the Taoist classics may be more relevant today than ever. Taoism is capable of acknowledging many of our modern beliefs about the human condition, like those of our insignificance, futile efforts, and inevitable death, yet it does not conclude that life is meaningless. Taoism crosses these concerns to another shore wherein no concern is rejected, but accepted in harmony with the natural course of things. Thus, it is said in the Liezi, "For all men, poverty is the norm and death is the end. Abiding by the norm, awaiting my end, what is there to be concerned about?" The Liezi is traditionally attributed to 100 schools of thought philosopher Lie Yuko, also known as Liezi. However, modern scholars do not attribute it to Lie Yuko in the 5th century BCE. Instead, they believe that the Liezi was a forgery by 4th century CE thinker Zhang Zhan. Either way, there is no doubt that the version available to us today is not the original version. Liezi is mentioned in the Zhuangzi on multiple accounts. But the one that says the most about the Liezi is when, in the Zhuangzi, it is said, "There was Liezi who rode on the wind and pursued his way with an admirable indifference to all external things." But one need not take Zhuangzi's description of Liezi literally, for Liezi did not know if he was riding on the wind or if the wind was riding on him. This is a result of Sitran. Sitran plays a central component in the Liezi. Sitran is often translated as nature, but such a rendering does not contain all that the concept is. The two components of the compound are Tzu and Ran. Tzu meaning of oneself or for oneself, and Ran meaning to be so or to be like this. This combined, Sitran, is what is so of itself, naturally so, or what is as it is. But we need not get caught up in the semantics. Let's have a look at its application. There are 5 direct references to Sit-Run in the Lietza. I'd like to talk about 3 of them. The first is in the chapter Yellow Emperor, when the Yellow Emperor himself travels to a nation in accordance with the Tao, where he finds this. In this country, there are no teachers and leaders. All things follow their natural course. The people have no cravings and lusts. All men follow their natural course. Therefore, within the ideal place, men, along with all other things, are spontaneous in their action and are so of themselves. Question of Tong. It is written of the things which do not need the 5 grains for food, nor floss silk for clothing, nor boat and car for travel. Their way is to be as they are of themselves. It is beyond the sage's understanding. For intellectual grasping or understanding is incapable of Sit-Run. It requires the letting go of thought and knowledge. Finally, there is a beautiful passage in the chapter on endeavor and destiny. It is said inscrutably, in endless sequence, they come to pass of themselves by the way of heaven. Indifferently, the broken circle turns of itself by the way of heaven. Heaven and earth cannot offend against this. The wisdom of sages cannot defy this. Demons and goblins cannot cheat this. Being of themselves, as they are, silently brings them about, gives them serenity, gives them peace, escorts them as they go, and welcomes them as they come. For peace and harmony lie within Sit-Run. Despite often being translated as nature, Sit-Run is not limited to the non-human. Graham points out that what separates humans from Sit-Run and the state of being so of ourselves is thought. Through thought, man creates motives, man creates good and bad. Nature, without thought, has no difficulty with Sit-Run, but man, overfilling with thoughts, does. For the man weighed down by thoughts is too heavy to ride the winds, like Lietza. It is said in the Lietza, when a drunken man is thrown from a cart, swiftly though he falls, it does not kill him. His bones and joints are the same as another man's, yet he is not harmed, as another man would be, because of the integrity of his spirit. He rides without knowing it, falls without knowing it. Sit-Run's counterpart is Wu-Wei, or non-action, but it's only mentioned once in the Lietza. And if you should like to hear more about the concept of Wu-Wei, I would suggest checking out my video, Taoism and Libertarianism. In the Lietza, it is said, rejoicing in nothing and knowing nothing are the true rejoicing and the true knowledge. And so, you rejoice in everything, know everything, care about everything, do everything. But if this is the case, then how can anything be accomplished? This question brings us to the Lietza's fatalism. The Lietza provides an account of Taoist fatalism which differs vastly from other forms of fatalism. Unlike Marxist materialism, there is not a destined purpose, and unlike Calvinist predeterminism, there is no divine plan. Things simply are as they are. They were what they were, and they will be what they will be. There is nothing that we can do to change this, for endeavor is powerless against destiny. The motto of Lietza's fatalism is therefore, it is what it is. The story of Qi Liang describes this. Qi Liang is a man who falls ill. His sons, concerned, bring him 3 different doctors. The first, a typical doctor, attributes the sickness to irregular meals, sexual overindulgence, and worrying too much. Qi Liang tolerates no such response. The second, a good doctor, attributes the sickness to the circumstances of his mother's womb and breasts. Qi Liang appreciates this response. The third, a divine doctor, does not attribute a cause and asks instead what medicine and the needle could possibly do for Qi Liang. Qi Liang celebrates this response, and the Lietza goes on to say, valuing life cannot preserve it. Taking care of the body cannot do it good. Scorning life cannot shorten it. Neglecting the body cannot do it harm. Hence, some who value life do not live. Some who scorn it do not die. Some who take care of the body do it no good. Some who neglect it do it no harm. This seems unreasonable, but it is not. In these cases, life and death, good and harm, all things come about themselves. Why would we toil over them? Thus, Graham writes, if we ought to train ourselves to allow our actions to be so of themselves, destined instead of forced by conscious endeavor, then pure fatalism is healthy instead of baleful, precisely because it undermines our faith in the utility of conscious choice. Such fatalism is not intended to spur inertia. Instead, it should motivate spontaneous action. It is so often that we look back with regret at that which we could have done better, and it is so often that we look forward with anxiety, fearing what we may do poorly. The Lietza's fatalism would extinguish both of these. All of this is to say, get out of your own way. Everything is constantly moving. There is nothing we can do about it. Through trying, you fail, so get out of your own way. And when you flow with the flow of things, you too can ride on the wind. The first chapter of the Lietza is largely devoted to arguments for the acceptance of death. Graham separates these out into 5 different arguments. First, the yin and yang of life and death. Life and death are yet another change of the yin and yang. Lietza's master said, birth and change are the norm. Things for which birth and change are the norm are at all times being born and changing. They simply follow the alternations of the yin and yang and the 4 seasons. This mimics the story of the death of Zhuangzi's wife, where Zhuangzi says, now there's been another change, and she's dead. It's just like the progression of the 4 seasons. Death is yet another transformation in the universal process of transformation. Second, our self is an illusion. Life is not our possession, thus we are never quite living. Lietza said, only he and I know that you were never born and will never die. Is it he who is truly miserable? Is it we who are truly happy? And your life is not your possession. You are the breath of heaven and earth, which goes to and fro. How can you ever possess it? Third, the nothingness we came from is our home. Death is a return. This passage mimics the Tao Te Ching in placing non-being before being. Thus death brings us back to non-being. In the Lietza, it is written, man in due course returns to the germs. All the myriad things come out of germs and go back to germs. What is born must die, what comes up must come down. For back with the germs is what in the Lietza is considered our true home. Fourth, one cannot be certain of what death entails. Lin Lei was a man near death, yet extremely happy. When questioned how he does so, he said, death is a return to where we set out from when we were born. So how do I know that when I die here, I shall not be born somewhere else? How do I know that life and death are not as good as each other? How do I know that it is not a delusion to crave anxiously for life? How do I know that present death would not be better than my past life? For this response, Lin Lei was described to be a man who had found it, but not all of it. Fifth, life is toil, death is rest. The last is the simplest of all. Life is a great toil, and death is a well-earned rest. Within the Lietza, it says, great is death, the gentleman finds rest in it, the mean man submits to it. If death is rest, why should anyone fear it? On top of all of this, the Lietza, in this chapter, is hostile towards immortality, saying, whatever ends cannot escape its end, just as what is born cannot escape birth, and to wish to live forever, and have no more ending, is to be deluded about our lot. However, there is no lack of mentions of immortals in the rest of Lietza, possibly indicating either a difference between mythology and philosophy, or just internal contradictions. For Lao Tzu's and Zhuangzi's take on death, have a look at my video on Death in the Tao. The Lietza cannot be talked about in depth without acknowledging the 7th of the 8 chapters, that is, the chapter about Yang Chu. The chapter of Yang Chu advocates for unadulterated hedonism. It shares ideas that run directly against Taoist ideas and those shared in the rest of the Lietza. As in the 3rd chapter, a hedonistic ruler looks back at his life and says, alas, I, who am king, have neglected virtue for pleasure. Will not future generations look back and blame me for my errors? For this reason, no matter the original author of the Lietza, the chapter on Yang Chu was likely added by another, a hedonist. The second author used Yang Chu as the proponent of his ideas, similar to how Confucius was used to espouse Taoist ideas earlier on in the Lietza. The historical Yang Chu, who the secondary author bases his work on, was not quite as much of a hedonist. Yang Chu was a thinker from the Warring States period, like Lie Yuko, whose ethics opposed those of the Confucians and Mohists because they were a form of egoism, not all that opposed to hedonism. The Yangist concept of Weiwo, or everything for myself, may further suggest that. But while the historical Yang Chu did not favor personal pleasures over health. The Lietza's Yang Chu's only focus is on pleasure. For as he suggests, what is man to live for? Where is he to find happiness? Only in fine clothes and good food, music and beautiful women. The historical Yang Chu was accepted within Tao circles for his emphasis on the cultivation of one's personal life. It is safe to say that the Lietza's Yang Chu would not have been. Their claims that the text was quite influenced by Buddhism, as shown in its suggestion of a karmic view of destiny and an understanding of perceptions as illusion. This, however, would come as no surprise if the text was truly written in the 4th century by Zhang Jian during a time of growing Buddhist influence. That's all I have to say about the Lietza. Thank you for watching. Feel free to let me know anything you thought I left out, or anything that you disagree with. And until next time.
There was a Taoist sage, later than Lao Tzu. His name was Lietze. We romanize that as L-I-E-H, Lieh. And he had a reputation for being able to ride on the wind. So light. Zhuangzi says in one place, it's easy enough to stand still. The difficulty is to walk without touching the ground. Because in the state of being in accord with the Tao, there is a certain feeling of weightlessness, parallel to the weightlessness that people feel when they get into outer space or when they go deep into the ocean. This is, of course, connected with the sensation that you're not carrying your body around. I described this morning the sensation that an expert driver has when he really is with it in a car, that the hill lifts him up and drops him down the other side, that he and the road are all one process. And that's equivalent to the sense of weightlessness. And so this is connected to, this is the inner meaning of Lietze riding on the wind. When Suzuki was asked, what is it like to have Satori, he said, it's just like ordinary everyday experience, except about 2 inches off the ground. And so we say in our own songs, walking on air, never a care, something is making me sing, tra-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la, like a little bird in spring. What is this then, weightlessness? It means, of course, partly that you're not moving around in constant opposition to yourself. Most people move in constant opposition to themselves because they are afraid that if they don't oppose themselves all the time, something awful will happen. See, it's so easy to bend your arm. No problem at all. But supposing you make a fight about it, and you take these antagonistic muscles, as they're called, and fight them against each other, so that you have to bend your arm like that. See? Well, how ridiculous. But if you somehow felt that in bending your arm you might make a mistake, you know, instead of bending it, you might hit yourself. Then these two muscles get nervous, and they fight each other to be sure that everything happens all right. That's anxiety, you see? So, when the human being developed the power to be aware of himself, to know that he knows, in other words, when the cortex was formed over the original brain, he fell from grace. That was the fall of man. Because when he felt, he had the sensation of being in charge, of being in control of himself, and you can only have that sensation when you are aware of what you're doing, he got anxious. Am I aware enough of myself? Have I taken enough factors into consideration? Have I done all that should be done? And then he started trembling. This was the fall of man, of course. This is what is meant. The Lao Tzu says, when the great Tao lost, there came duty to man and right conduct. In other words, nobody talks about how you ought to behave unless things have gone radically wrong. There wouldn't be any conception of faithful ministers of the state unless there were a lot of lousy politicians around. No one would talk about filial piety unless there were wayward sons and daughters. So there is constantly in the tradition of Taoism the idea that all moral preaching is confusion. There's a marvelous case of this in the Zhuangzi book, where there's an alleged conversation between Confucius and Lao Tzu, in which Lao Tzu asks Confucius to explain to him what is charity and duty to one's neighbor. And Confucius gives him a little sermon, on being, giving up one's self-interest and working for others. And Lao Tzu says, what stuff? Sir, regard the universe. He says, the stars come out invariably every night. The sun rises and sets. The birds flock and migrate without exception. All flowers and trees grow upwards without exception. You, by your talk of charity and duty to one's neighbor, you're just introducing confusion into the empire. Your attempt to eliminate self is a positive manifestation of selfishness. You are like a person beating a drum in search of a fugitive. The modern equivalent of that would be the police car about to raid a bad nightclub and coming with its siren full on. See? And everybody in the club gets out. So, all talk about selfishness, all talk about success in becoming virtuous, or enlightened, or integrated, or non-neurotic, or self-actualized. Let's use all the terms that are being used. All this talk attests to the fact that it hasn't happened, and will in fact get in the way of its happening. Well, to go back to Lietze, who succeeded in riding the wind, what happened? Lietze found a very great master and went to study with him. And the master lived in a small hut, and Lietze sat outside the hut. And the master paid absolutely no attention to him. This is sort of the way with Taoist masters. Because why would they want students? They have nothing to teach. So after a year sitting outside, Lietze went away. And he just fed up with waiting so long. Then he sort of got regretful about this and thought he really should make a try. So he went back to the master, who said, why this ceaseless coming and going? So he sat there and tried to control his mind in such a way that he would not think of the differences between gain and loss. In other words, try to live in such a way that nothing is either an advantage or a disadvantage. Once upon a time, there was a Chinese farmer whose horse ran away. And all the neighbors came around to commiserate that evening. So sorry to hear your horse has run away. That's too bad. And he said, maybe. The next day the horse came back, bringing 7 wild horses with it. And everybody came around in the evening and said, oh, isn't that lucky? What a great turn of events. You've now got 8 horses. And he said, maybe. The next day his son tried to break one of these horses and ride it, and was thrown and broke his leg. And they all said, "Oh dear, that's too bad." And he said, "Maybe." The following day, the conscription officers came around to recruit, to force people into the army, and they rejected his son because he had a broken leg. And all the people came around and said, "Isn't that great?" And he said, "Maybe." You see, that is the attitude of not thinking of things in terms of gain or loss, advantage or disadvantage, because you don't really know. The fact that you might get a letter from a solicitor, from a law office tomorrow, saying that some distant relative of yours had left you $1 million, it might be something you would feel very, very happy about. But the disasters that it could lead to are unbelievable. Internal revenue. To mention only one possibility. You never really know whether something is fortune or misfortune. We only know the momentary changes and as it alters our sense of hope about things. The Taoist is wise enough eventually, you see, to understand that there isn't any fixed good or bad. And so his point of view is what is called non-choosing.